Okay. Lights, camera, action. Hello, my name is Rachel Miner.
And I'm Anna Mock.
Welcome to the first installment of Viola Extravaganza, a video series where we chat all things music with viola superstars around the world.
Get to know their hot takes on classical music culture, schools, jobs, technique, and other spicy subjects.
You're in for a ride.
And disclaimer, this show is not just for violists. Hello, everyone. My name is Anna, and I am a first-year master's student at the University of Denver studying with Basil Vendreas. I completed my undergrad in May 2020, where I studied with Steve Wyrczynski.
My name is Rachel Miner. I am a fourth-year student at Pepperdine University studying Hispanic Studies and viola performance, where I study with Carolina Naziumiak, and I studied with Andrew Picken for 3 years. And now if Professor Wei and Professor Wyrczynski want to introduce themselves.
I'm an associate professor of viola at Western University in London, Ontario.
I am Steve Wyrczynski, and I teach viola at the Jacobs School of Music in Bloomington, Indiana.
Wonderful. So back a few months ago when we were all at the Karen Tuttle Viola Workshop online, Anna and I had a FaceTime with Professor Wei, and she mentioned that you two know each other. And we were just wanting to know if you'd share how you guys met and what kind of relationship you have.
I think we met at my teacher's house, right? At Roberta Diaz's house when I was babysitting. And I think that's where I met you, Steve.
And before that, you were taking lessons with Joe DiPasquale, right?
No, I was a shared student with Karen Tuttle and Roberto.
Well, how did didn't Joe DiPasquale know you? I mean, Joe DiPasquale raved about you.
Oh.
So yeah. I knew your name way before I met you because he was like, Sharon Wei. And he didn't do that much.
I knew him from viola sectionals because we had him every week in sectionals. But I never was lucky enough to have a lesson with him.
Well, for those of you who don't know, Joe DiPasquale, who would have been 100 in 2019,
wow,
was principal viola in Boston Symphony for many years, and then joined his brothers, who formed a quartet in the Philadelphia Orchestra. I think it was 1966 they came. And one of the main reasons he went to Philadelphia is to teach Curtis. And anyway, so I heard lots about Sharon Wei from Joe. And then I met you at Roberto Diaz's house. And we lived Roberto's house was only 4 blocks away from mine. So we were in very close contact.
You play with Philly Orchestra like every Saturday because we used to get tickets at school, and always had good views of the viola section.
Mm-hmm.
Did you two overlap at Curtis?
No, I was done in 1991, so that was 10 years before you, or?
Yeah, I started in 2004, but you would have overlapped with my husband then, right?
Yeah, so Scott St. John, Mr. Sharon Wei was there when I was there.
So how was it that you were at Professor Diaz's house?
Roberto lived 4 blocks away, so we would walk home from concerts, after concerts together. We would share a cab if we were coming from the train station. We walked our dogs together regularly. Roberto's wife, Alyssa Coleonian, would meet in the park and walk our dogs and talk about her favorite binge foods when she was pregnant. And I wasn't pregnant, but I still was having binge foods.
Of course.
As one does. Also, a question for both of you, just in general, how did you both get into music in the first place?
I was a bit of a late bloomer. I think I always had music in my life, but never really thought about it as a profession until much later, not until undergrad years, actually. I switched to viola my last year, and yeah, and then something just kind of happens. Something happens when you switch to viola. And, everything is much clearer.
Were you a violinist first?
Mhm.
I think William Primrose called that he saw the light.
And I started in public school in violin and then switched to viola when I was 16, and then really committed to it. And I grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs, and my dream was to play in the Philadelphia Orchestra. So it was like, wanting to play for the New York Yankees or something. It seemed impossible. Actually, Karen Tuttle, my first lesson, said, "What's your ultimate goal in music?" And I said, "To go to Curtis." And she said, "Well, that's not an ultimate goal. That's a goal. What's your ultimate goal?" And I summoned the courage to say to play in the Philadelphia Orchestra, which was really absurd, for me to say at that time. I was no virtuoso. And she said, "Okay, this is what we have to do."
Mhm.
So
I remember I think you asked me that same question too, like where do you see yourself in many years? And it's something you don't always think about while you're in school. You kind of just like go through the motions of it. But it's definitely helpful from my perspective to keep that in mind so that you could take ownership of your education while you're in school.
I think it's really special that Karen Tuttle, instead of telling you that, oh, that's going to be way too difficult, or that's a far off goal, she said, okay, let's make the steps to do that.
Yeah.
Because
and she wasn't even an orchestra player, or she never pretended to be an orchestra player, but she knew things that I had to do, and she knew skills I had to learn, and you know didn't tarnish or shame me in any way. It was really remarkable. So I do try to do that to my students, and no matter what it is. I mean, you have to really commit to it.
mm-hmm.
Were you a shared student with Miss Tuttle, or?
No, I started at Peabody with her, and then she left Peabody, and I followed her to Juilliard. And then I graduated from Juilliard and then went to Curtis with her. And then my final year, I said to Karen, I think I have to learn how they play. And she said, "Go ahead, honey, go study with Joe." So, I mean, she gave me her blessing, and I went to Joe and learned how they played, which was very distinctive at the time. Yeah.
How did that differ from the way Karen Tuttle taught you?
Joe's teaching he was a natural, so he demonstrated a lot, he played a lot. He often would say, "This is what it sounds like, do it like this." Um, so he wouldn't really analyze things. I mean, Karen Tuttle was a masterful diagnostician, and she would say, you're holding here, you're tense here, you got to do this, you're off balance. And Joe would just say, "Sounds like this." And I wouldn't have been ready for that had I not had the training I had with Karen Tuttle. So it was like going into the deep end.
Would you consider Karen Tuttle and Joseph De Pasquale your biggest musical influences, or do you have other musical influences as well?
Karen Tuttle, enormous musical influence. She's my musical mother. And my other musical mother is the great violinist and violin teacher, Sylvia Rosenberg. I adore her. She taught me so much as a chair music coach. And it blows my mind that now we're friends and colleagues. And so she is also an enormous influence.
Mm-hmm. And how about you, Professor Wei?
Yeah, so for me, when I was in my undergrad, I actually studied viola with a violinist, with a Hungarian, Loran Fenyevich. And I don't know if this is a name you might have come across, but he taught, I think, 3 generations of Canadians. He was in his 80s when I knew him, and he kind of looked like Yoda and spoke like, and he could wiggle his ears, and you know, all of his lessons were these lessons not just in music but also in life, just kind of life lessons too along the way. And time always kind of stood still with him because he never really worried about time. So your lessons would go on, and you knew that if you were at the end of the day, you probably would have a much later lesson than scheduled. And it was just so nice to have these unhurried lessons with him.
I do remember when I was a student, many great violists studied with him.
Both are professors at universities. So, what inspired you to teach?
So Karen Tuttle, in addition to being, this inspirational musician and teacher, she wanted all her students to learn how to teach. So in fact, the last lesson of the year, she would say, okay, I don't know anything about the viola, teach me how to play the viola. And you would say, okay, first you've got to take your viola and put it here and do that. And that was a recurring theme. She wanted you to think about teaching. So that meant upperclassmen help lowerclassmen. So you'll see lots of, on resumes of Karen Tuttle students, they'll say teaching assistant, many of them. That's because she was always recycling the upperclassmen, teaching the lowerclassmen. So I was doing this for a while. And when I got into the orchestra, I stopped doing it just because I wanted to absorb everything in the orchestra. Then I started teaching again, and I got invited by Vicki Chang to give a class at Peabody. I started teaching at Peabody. So I started going there every week and teaching. And then Vicki Chang got me invited to be on the faculty of Aspen. So then I was teaching at a major conservatory and teaching at a major music festival. And for a while, the orchestra and that were compatible. But at a certain point, the orchestra started saying, you can't do that. We'll let you out for this, but you can't do that. And I had reached like the 18-year mark with the orchestra, and there was a fork in the road. So the opportunity at IU presented itself, and I thought, well, I've done the orchestra now for 18 years. I could, do something different full time. And Vicki Chang also said to me, if you really want to teach, you got to do it full time. And so I did it. And plus, my husband and I our fantasy was to live on a farm. I mean, there's not too many conservatories where you can go, drive 20 minutes and you're at your bucolic residence with chickens and fruit trees and bees. And so I took the opportunity. I never regretted it. I mean, it was a great life in Philadelphia, but here I am, country Steve.
I think I always did a little bit of teaching because when I finished, so I studied with Jesse Levine at Yale after I left Curtis, and then I ended up staying for an extra year teaching in the undergraduate school and also doing some chamber music coaching, and that was really fun. And then I ended up moving to California, and I had the same kind of job at Stanford, and it was always a really interesting kind of student because most of these students were not going to be music majors, but they loved music and they were very passionate, actually in some ways even more so sometimes than music majors. And so it was just a really, I loved teaching that kind of student who have lots of different interests. And recently, years ago, I was back visiting the Stanford campus and we were walking by the dorm parents. And I heard someone on the phone and all I could hear was, but music is not just about tempo. I mean, doesn't the conductor understand that? And I thought, oh, this is exactly what I missed. Probably an engineering or a business student walking down the road having this conversation. But the job at Western actually kind of came a little bit accidentally. There's a small town about 45 minutes away from London, Ontario, called Stratford, and it's a big theater town. And one of my mentors from my undergraduate year as a collaborative pianist had called me and said, "Oh, I heard you moved to Stratford. You should consider applying for this job." And I said, "No, I live at Stanford in California." But it just kind of came at this moment where, Scott was in the quartet and he had been, on the road about 100 days a year for 7 years or so. And it was kind of this moment where we had just had a new baby and everything. And it was a moment to try to think about, could we make a change and what would that look like? And I think we never imagined that we would be back in London, Ontario. Scott is from here. He grew up here and I did my undergrad. But we've never looked back. I mean, it's been really amazing to be back where I did my undergrad. And I think it made the transition easier too, because I knew who was kind of in charge of what, and it made projects much more possible and faster in some ways, because I didn't feel so new in many ways. So I've enjoyed seeing the students, go through their 4 years and sometimes longer, and it's been really a fascinating journey.
Also, we were kind of wondering, why are both of you passionate about music? What specifically about it really made you come to love it and want to pursue it as a profession?
I was involved for a long time with the Verbier Music Festival, and especially their chamber orchestra. And their chamber orchestra was comprised of musicians from all over the world. So, often in this chamber orchestra, there would be about 15 to 20 countries represented. And we all kind of grew up together in our 20s. And so we were always so happy to come together for projects that it made the music making, I don't know, it just always felt fresh and fun. We were lucky to have great conductors, and we went through a whole bunch of kind of weird boot camps together, what I consider. We had these with Maxime Vengerov where, we were recording the Mozart concertos, which shouldn't take so long, but it was about a 3-year project where we would meet for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, rehearse about 8 hours a day, and it made us play these concertos and symphonies in a really different way. Like we just I don't know, it felt so good. And even now when I go back to play with this group, it feels there's just so much talking through the music, and I find that when you have that also in chamber music, that you can't really replace that feeling anywhere.
I feel the same way about music. That's kind of why I love it as well. How about you, Professor Wyrczynski?
Music, I might say something cliche here, but music is this unspoken form of communication. It's also, for me, a connection like to the spiritual, not so much in terms of, say, religion, but it transcends our human body. First of all, everybody loves music. There are very few people that don't like music, right? So music speaks to this other thing that humans have. Even primitive cultures have some type of music that transcends the spoken word or transcends. I think that's why there's such longevity in our profession, is because people are wrestling with this and trying to refine this and trying to rediscover even repertoire that they've played thousands, tens of thousands of times. They're going back to find something else. So I think that for me is what is so important about teaching, to kind of reveal this transcendent level of music, because as students and teachers, you're talking about intonation. I want to play correctly. I want to be excellent. I want to get better. So we kind of codify this very open-ended transcendence, for lack of a better word.
Absolutely. And I think one other aspect of that and how special music is just when you see videos of music therapy helping Alzheimer's patients or
stroke victims.
Mm-hmm. It's incredible. I saw one recently of a former ballerina. She's elderly now, and so she hasn't been a professional ballerina in years, but they played Swan Lake in her headphones and she remembered all of the arm movements, and you get to see her doing them. It was really special.
This past quarter, I was also a research assistant and was in community music, and hearing about like the social impact in music as well and how it could further develop communities for the good has been really fascinating to read about. Something I'm also wondering, what are some of your most memorable either performances or teaching moments?
Performing moments, it's hard to choose. I think working with some amazing conductors who are able to not say very much, but exactly what they're trying to have you feel. I think those are the best moments, when you feel it. And it's not even so much that they're leading. There was one conductor that I met who said, this doesn't make any sound, right? Like this is just a guide, and you should just keep me in the back, like kind of like checking with the back rear view mirror of a car, because it's up to you to actually make the sound, and I'm just here a little bit to kind of keep things going. But then it was amazing because we were playing Schubert 9 with this conductor, and by the end, I mean, he was like, there's the big C chords, and it was the end of like a 3-hour concert, and there had been so much energy building up, and it's a concert that anyone who was at that concert still talks about, even though it was 20 years ago. I don't know, when a whole orchestra can come together like that. Yeah, those kind of moments are really memorable.
So 3 hours, does that mean he took the repeats in the Schubert?
Oh yeah, we took the concert to kick off the whole festival, and it was a brand new orchestra, and so I think there were like 3 different soloists, and Schubert 9 was the big finisher. But it was also like Rhapsody in Blue and the Mahler Wayfarer songs, and oh gosh, there were so many things.
That's a big concert.
Yeah, the Schubert 9 was really, and I think again because this orchestra had come together, it was brand new, and I think we had like 16 rehearsals on Schubert 9 too. So we were very well rehearsed.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really amazing to feel that.
My most memorable teaching experience, and Anna, we just referenced it earlier. I mean, say if I talk to a student like Anna Mach, and all of a sudden she's identifying what really inspires her about music, or the kind of music she likes, or she discovers her expertise, I think to me, that is the most gratifying thing. So, since you're here, Anna, I mean, as soon as you found that, you were transported. I mean, you were different in every way.
Oh gosh.
Well, don't you think?
True. It's true. I saw it too.
I mean, the sky's the limit now. That's the most moving thing to me.
If you were going to start off a new student, like doesn't know anything about the viola, what would be your process? And what is your process of teaching technique to create like the most ideal situation, given that they practice, of course?
That's the kicker.
Yes, that's the kicker.
I have such respect for teachers who start from the beginning. This past year when we were living in LA, we met, actually, Steve, you probably know her, Amy Creston.
Yes, of course.
So she started teaching my daughter this year, and I have to say I loved going to every single one of her lessons. I learned so much about how to teach at the beginning that I had no idea. It was amazing to see her, bringing like scales and etudes, and now she's assigned the first Bach suite for my daughter to learn on violin, which I've also never heard of a young person doing that on violin. And and I just love her way of teaching. and how she brings these ideas. So I don't know. I think to start someone from the beginning, I feel that I would be very out of my element.
It's a specialty. And, at IU, we have Mimi Zweig and Brenda Brenner who do it. And that's a discipline in itself. So,
No, I've learned so much from taking their courses, not just like what to teach them, but also how to teach them as well. How do you break things down so that like a kindergartner can understand it? Because they're not going to understand anatomy necessarily. And how do you present violin or viola in a way that's fun and engaging while still teaching them as well?
Wolfart and Subcheck have all these duos, duo studies. And so we end up playing a lot actually together with our daughter. And that's been so great. They're very short, like one line, two lines. And so every week there's something new. And I think, just to get that love of playing together started early has been really eye-opening for me.
And from what I understand, also a lot of, at least with my peers that I've talked to, I was kind of the same way too. Like I started on violin and it was just kind of a hobby that I did after school. But when I started youth orchestra and started playing with other people, that's when I was like, oh, this is what music is all about.
Mm-hmm. It was the same for me. It was really when I went to Interlochen for the first time. That's what changed it for me, because I was finally in an environment where other people loved it too, and we could play together. Whereas before, I played with other people who didn't necessarily love it. And I think it makes all the difference in the world when you're playing with other people who want to be musicians. And also, how do you integrate technique and musicianship into your teaching?
well, with my students, I find that it takes about a year for me to get to know the student and for the student to get to know me. So during that year, we have to develop a vocabulary. And I do go over technical things that I explain and that the student practices, bow changes, certain strokes, shifting, which all my students find possibly amusing. Um, and so then we do etudes and we do, studies and so forth. I don't have a fundamentalist attitude about technique. But I do think it's important to develop a vocabulary about technical aspects with the student, because otherwise, the student has to learn how to problem solve. The teacher has to learn how to diagnose and talk about things in a common language.
I think for me, I feel that I kind of missed the boat on a really like regimented technical training. And so so sometimes I feel a little bit like flying by the seat of my pants for teaching. And so my kind of go-to, I guess, teaching philosophy is if you're working on a piece, like what is the story? What do you and once you have a story, what does that mean in terms of sound? What kind of sound are you after? And then you kind of work backwards. Okay, so what kind of like how are you going to get yourself to make that sound? And to kind of go backwards from an idea and then to try and find the technique that's going to help execute that musical expression. So that happens a lot in my lessons.
I found that was the most effective way of approaching my music, because when I had lessons with you, Professor Wei, I feel like everything changed in my playing, just in terms of my direction and my musicality. Because before that, I would try to make things more musical, but I really do think that approach works really well for me, at least.
Of course, like all students, they respond to technique or other aspects of teaching differently. So, how do you identify a learning style in a student?
A couple things. I mean, I try to figure out, with the students' help, is how they learn. I ask them if they're visual learners, if they're audio learners, or if they're tactile learners. And I give them an assignment, figure out how you learn? Do you have to write things down before you remember them? Can you just, are you the kind of person that goes to a movie and can remember the lines from listening? Do you have to see the music in your head in order to memorize it? So the student and I try to figure out what kind of learner they are. And the other thing, I ask the student what they do well. And you think I would ask the student if I could have one of their kidneys because they're paralyzed with fear. They could speak for 20 minutes about all their terrible flaws, but I said, what do you do well? So a student that needs to know what they do well, and they do things well. I know that's painful for them to hear, but they have to know, they have to be able to negotiate those, the good and the to be improved.
I think that's a really valuable question to ask. And I think, often you see students after a concert and it's really hard for them to take in compliments, from people who come up to them in the audience or their peers or their teachers. And I think it's really important that students are able to take that in, to actually hear what people are saying. I think when you discount it, it means that the person saying it, their opinion didn't count somehow, and I think it's really important for students to realize that it's that they need to be able to accept, the compliments as well as the criticism.
Absolutely. I know that's been an issue of mine in the past, and I've been trying to work through that, trying to remember that your performance was not all about your mistakes. It was so much more than that. Um, Kind of with that, what do you think is the importance of studio class, and how do you manage your studio environment or culture?
Mine is, I think, much more informal probably than most other teachers that I've heard of, at least at my school. I highly encourage students to play as much as they can every week if they can, even if it's just to try something, because you see that progression through the semester. And it's not just for them, but for the other students in the class too, to be able to see that it is these small steps that grow into something bigger by the end of the semester. And for me, definitely it's more about the other students making comments, because it's a way for them to practice teaching as well. And it's one of the few moments that they'll have, like on a regular basis, unless they're taking a pedagogy class, to practice those listening skills and to be able to express themselves. And you definitely see over, graduate years that a lot of students are very quiet in first year, second year, but then all of a sudden in third and fourth, they have a lot to say. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful to see them thinking critically like that, but then also knowing how to say something, to give feedback in a positive way.
My studio class, I mean, Sharon, I'm so glad to hear that. I have my students play as much as they can, week after week after week after week. So they're playing an etude, they're playing a part of an etude, they're playing part of a movement, even a scale, whatever. And I want them to get nervous. I want them to anticipate getting nervous. I want them to know how they themselves get nervous. Um, so that every week they're practicing kind of the performative skills, that so they're not just doing studio class as a dress rehearsal. It's been week after week after week. So they're learning about, again, how they themselves get nervous. I mean, some people have sweaty palms. Some people feel nauseated. Some people get cold. Some people, it goes, some people don't feel nervous at all until the middle of their playing, and then they become terrified. So those are important things that people need to learn. Where we differ, Sharon, I don't have students make comments. And I say jokingly to my students that it's my studio class and I only want to hear my voice. And the reason is because if I'm working on a student, say with a relaxed thumb, and I said, I want you to play this etude 5 pianissimos, and they get up and they play 5 pianissimos, and nobody else knows what we're working on or what the goal is, I don't want to hear, well, your tone isn't very good. Or, why is it so soft and it's not musical and I wish you would freeze. I feel like whatever my goal with my mutually agreed upon goal for my student is between us. I personally, when I was a student, hated other students' comments. Because, oh, you have a nice tone. I think you could do better on your shifting. Okay. I mean, it was always the same. So, I don't know, maybe I need therapy, Sharon.
Oh man.
I think it is. It's really important to practice being nervous. And yeah, sometimes the commentary, it is a little bit of a free for all for sure. But especially when students have played the piece that they're listening to, I'm always so curious to know what they're thinking too. And sometimes it can be very helpful. But you definitely have to wade through a lot of commentary.
Something that I liked in Steve's studio class is like, especially seeing people playing week after week, and especially if you were playing the same piece as someone. I remember, I think it was my junior year, there were like at least 4 people, myself included, playing the Walton Concerto, and everyone was playing it completely differently. And it's just really amazing to see like how other people are approaching it.
I went to a few of hers over the summer. I really like, one, everyone in her studio is wonderful and very kind, but also at the beginning of the class, we all do stretches. So, we take turns. Someone will say, let's do this stretch. And while we're doing that stretch, they'll talk about how their week was. I thought that was good, healthy habits, and nice to just hear how everyone is doing as well.
So where we're going with that is now Steve's studio, we're gonna do group stretches, right?
I'm too fat.
No, you are not.
So Steve, you have to know that my studio class is Tuesday mornings at 8 a.m. So we do need to stretch just to wake up.
Okay, well, if we change to 8 a.m. in the morning, we'll do stretch. We'll have coffee and donuts and stretching.
I would be there for that.
I had mine with me since it was online. I had my coffee right there, did the stretches. It was a very pleasant time.
Just kind of thinking about like studio class and also, I guess more broadly, how have conservatories and music universities changed throughout the decades?
Students are savvier now. I feel that when we were in school, we were definitely more in a bubble, with our teachers and our colleagues. And now, you guys have the internet. We didn't have the internet when we were students. And so it was hard to know what other people were doing at other schools. And I think, especially during the pandemic, you've seen that it's a lot of the smaller organizations that have been able to be more flexible and to be able to pivot and try new ideas. And I think it's really important for students to try, to just have an idea and go for it. And you'll probably fail along the way, but then that leads you to the next idea. And I think that there's more of an understanding of that kind of project making in music schools now, and it's really being encouraged. Whereas I feel that when we were in school, we did have to have that kind of far-reaching goal of like, okay, which orchestra am I going to audition for, or do I want to be part of a chamber group? Or it was much more siloed, and I feel that now it's much more accepted that you're probably going to have lots of different things that you do in your life related to music, or that you might use your musical school skills completely in a different profession too. I think that people are much more open these days.
I mean, the thing that bothers me about now is that there's this whole how am I going to get a job thing, or I want to get a job. Like somehow all your problems are going to be solved if you get a job, which means in like conservatory talk, I want to get an orchestra job, which is, I don't know, it seems, I understand like somehow the kind of projected security of that, but it seems a little bit like students are following a formula along that line. And I agree with Sharon, there's so many. I mean, now the musicians that are going to thrive are the ones that have all kinds of things going on. And the people that are in orchestras now have to rethink what they're doing because the 52-week season with 10 weeks paid vacation and the month of touring, I'm not sure that's going to bounce back the same way it was.
Do you think that the current conservatory model is relevant or prepares students for today's profession?
I mean, it depends what conservatory we're talking about, I think. I think the emphasis on entrepreneurship is a good thing. I do think that there has to be probably more flexibility in choosing one's own curriculum according to your interests. I mean, so much of what we do, like Curtis was like the French conservatory model, which worked, as Curtis was kind of the virtuoso factory for a long time. But, now I don't know. I think more importantly, the financial constraints of high tuition, high living costs are crushing to students. If you leave conservatory with 75, 100,000, $200,000 of debt, you're not going to have many choices.
I know both of you teach at universities. What are your thoughts on like maybe a student who's deciding between universities and conservatories, like universities where they could major in music versus conservatories?
I mean, I think for me, universities are a place where you can also explore other interests, because hopefully as a musician, you will have other interests as well. And it's a way to branch out and to meet professors that teach other things. And that can also be within music too, because, music is so broad. I think my advice is to always try to meet as many professors as you can and to really try to get to know them, because they have so much to offer. And it's not just your major teacher that is going to make your university experience, but it's the other people that you meet as well. So whether that's in a university or a conservatory, it's about putting yourself out there.
And Professor Wei, what is your advice for any young musicians who want to have a career in chamber music or start their own chamber ensemble?
So speaking from personal experience, I think sometimes a group can look really great on paper, and when the group gets together, it doesn't work. And I think that you have to be ready. Again, it's about figuring out the culture of a group and the chemistry. It takes time and a lot of patience to figure out how you're going to be, who's going to be in charge of what. It's almost nothing to do with the playing sometimes, but it's more the personality conflicts. It takes time for a group to grow together, and that there's always so many variables to consider, because it's not just the group, it's their families as well, especially if it's an older group. It can be very hard to have a shared vision between an ensemble. It's hard to be very clear between more than two people.
Mm-hmm.
Something I was wondering about in chamber music, I mean, of course, there are so many chamber ensembles that play at such a high level. How do certain chamber ensembles or maybe your piano quartet present themselves to the public to show like, here's how we're special or here's how we're maybe different?
Yeah, so I think these days it is a little harder, because there's just such a proliferation of string quartets, especially right now compared to 2 generations ago, and a lot of quartets who are trying to make it. That's their main job. I think that's very difficult, and one of the reasons why we are a piano quartet is because in Canada there really wasn't like a professional touring piano quartet. And so that was one way we could already distinguish ourselves from piano trios or from string quartets. But also, I was very lucky because the pianists in my group, we met in first year university. We've been playing together. Next year will be our 25th season of playing together. And yeah, and I mean, without her, I mean, I I feel like she's the backbone of the group. But I've been very lucky, and I realize now even more so to have found her, so early on, and that we've been able to work nicely together. We've never had a bad word between us, and I can't say that's the same with everyone else in our group. We've been really lucky to click.
For sure. Since we've been talking for about an hour and a half, we'll probably move on to a few just quick fun fact questions. Do you speak any other languages?
I grew up going to French school, so I speak French pretty fluently. I have a very kind of 5-year-old speaking knowledge of Chinese, and I definitely dabbled in other languages, but just like always the beginner courses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have about a 3-year-old's understanding of Polish, so there.
What about you, Anna?
I took Spanish in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the end of that story.
And
I have
Rachel?
Spanish, of course. I'm a Spanish major, so.
And are you fluent?
Basically, I'm like getting really close. If COVID is any better, I might get to go to Spain this summer and on like an intensive trip with a bunch of other Spanish majors, and I have to sign a contract saying I won't speak English. So I'm hoping that'll get it more fluent, but I'm pretty close. What is your favorite pastime?
Play a lot of board games in my house. A lot of Settlers of Catan recently, a lot of Exploding Kittens.
A great game.
So we really like board games, and we do a lot of online euchre with our family during the pandemic.
Well, I have lots of nature out here. So I have attracted and started a colony of purple martins. I don't know if you know what purple martins are. There's a certain kind of bird that only live in human constructed homes. And I'm sure you've seen white houses with round holes in them, a lot of places. The problem is they're very hard to attract, and their numbers have declined quite a bit. So I started a purple martin colony. So I last summer had like 7 pairs of martins come. And so they come during the summer, and then they live in the rainforests of Brazil during the winter. And they remember the same pair comes back to the exact spot.
Anna, next question.
Favorite place you've visited?
The piano quartet, we were really lucky. We got to go to every province and territory the last couple of years. And for me, going up north to Nunavut was really special. There are no roads that go there. It's a fly-in community, and they only have 2 shipments of food every year, one in the spring, one in the fall. And there's so much art that happens up there, lots of music making, and it was fascinating. I mean, it's a part of the country I wish more Canadians could experience, to know that it's not just about living in the cities, and that there's so much that happens in these smaller communities.
Gosh, I'm not sure I could narrow it down. I mean, when I was in the orchestra, I got to see the world, and we stayed in unbelievable hotels. There will be people complaining about their room. So my colleague, Peter Stump, and I, a running joke is we like get into a hotel, like the Four Seasons in Paris, be like, this is a dump. It's disgusting.
So fun.
A favorite hotel from those tours?
Pardon?
Have a favorite hotel from those tours?
Gosh, there's this amazing Mandarin Oriental in Kuala Lumpur. That was very nice.
US versus Canada.
Oh gosh, Canada is so far surpassing the United States on how they're taking care of COVID. I mean,
All relative.
well, I mean, I'd say that says it all right there. Got to protect our people.
Somebody once told me that this happens in business, but I think it pertains to the arts as well, is that in the States, people are much more willing to be risk takers. And in Canada, people have very long memories. And so sometimes, oh, well, maybe you don't want to work with that person because 20 years ago, blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that really happens so much in the States, where you have much more of a blank slate. And so, yeah, and that's been interesting because I lived in the US for 15 years and then came back here, and it is a very different culture, for sure. It's much more regional as well. I think I was so surprised in the US that people apply all over the country. And here, people really tend to stay in their province, or maybe they might go over one province, but it's very, yeah, geographically, it's very interesting that way.
Certainly. And
What's your favorite type of cuisine?
I like food so much that I don't think I have a favorite. I have lots of food that I love from all different cultures.
Yeah, I'm not very picky. I was watching something on, watching a movie, and they showed so many scenes in restaurants, and they were eating, and they weren't wearing, it was before the pandemic, and it just looked so inviting. And, I thought, wow, I really miss going out to eat and meeting people, at restaurants and stuff.
Yeah, takeout's just, it's not the same. It's not it.
It's not the same.
Anna, what's your favorite cuisine?
Oh gosh, I think I lean more towards Professor Wei. I like so many different foods. But if I had to pick a favorite, I mean, of course, I'm biased. I like Filipino food. And I like other Asian food as well.
I'm also very biased. Indian food is by far my favorite. My mom's Indian. But I also like any Asian food pretty much. But Indian is definitely my favorite.
And Northern Indian, Southern Indian, I mean, there's different disparity.
Yeah, my mom's actually Parsi. Her family came from Mumbai. But she's Parsi, which is its own specific population as well. But I like all Indian food. And what is your favorite orchestra or chamber ensemble?
Gosh, the recordings of the Guarneri Quartet are so good. The old Juilliard, the original Juilliard Quartet, they're so good.
Yeah, the Guarneri Quartet recording of Mendelssohn Octet, it's like a rock concert. It's so exciting. For a while, I was really obsessed with the Sikovetsky recording of the Goldberg Variations for chamber orchestra. I just thought that was such a great way to explore that piece. And for a while, I listened to that a lot, like every day.
What about you, Anna?
Well, I grew up listening to the Emerson Quartet for like a very long time in my life. So just because of that, like, I guess, nostalgic sense, I love the Emerson Quartet. Also, of course, the Dover Quartet is incredible. Like, Milena is one of my viola idols.
Yes, she is definitely one of mine as well. Dover Quartet's my favorite, but I also love the Guarneri Quartet.
These questions are really terrific. How long did it take for you to come up with them? They're like Barbara Walters questions.
We met over Zoom a few times and we brainstormed some questions.
And then we practiced them with a friend, with a viola friend who just kind of
Wilfred.
Oh, yeah, it was Wilfred. He just made up what he thought would be answers.
Oh, was he doing impressions of me? I want to see those.
He might have done that.
Yeah.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Coffee.
Anna?
1000% coffee.
I love both, but if I have to pick, it's definitely coffee because, it's just necessary.
Yeah. And
Like,
it's so good.
it's so good. Our big contentious question. With your left hand, do you leave your fingers down?
Or do you lift them?
What was that, Sharon?
Oh, fingers down for me. Shift for octave.
Yeah.
I think it's also because my hand is much smaller. I need everything down all the time.
Did Karen Tuttle say that to you? Keep your fingers down.
No, I don't remember. You know, it's so funny, but I think that she must have because it was so funny during the Karen Tuttle workshop that I hadn't thought about her teaching in a while. But then all of a sudden, when I was going to everyone's master classes and yours included, and you guys were saying things, and I was like, oh, that's why I say that. It's from Miss Tuttle, and I'd almost forgotten that it was really from her. And so I think that I must have gotten that from her.
She insisted that I not keep fingers down because she used to say each finger needs its own balance. What it doesn't mean is that you're like an octopus, right? But you release the weight on the finger, so you don't keep the weight down on the finger, so that each finger has its own balance. That's
And what do
she
you
would
do
say.
for octaves? Do you keep 2 and 3 up, or are they down?
Yeah, you don't have 2 and 3 down. I mean, you don't have them like this, but yeah. I mean, when you watch string players play, they keep some of the fingers down. Even the people that say keep your fingers down, they don't keep all their fingers down.
That's true.
And I would say that people that say don't keep your fingers down, they keep some of their fingers down.
That's,
So there, we have
that's
detente.
that's basically where Anna and I came to, because Anna, Wilfred, and I all talked about this because we've all had teachers who have been staunchly one or the other, and we're kind of like, well, in reality, is it ever actually completely one or the other, or is it sometimes you find it like you need your fingers down for whatever reason, and then there are other times where you lift them? At least that's been our experience with it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me is that if you keep your fingers down, that doesn't give one a free pass that it's going to be the same pitch as you left, right?
That's
So
true.
there's this assumption that I'm going to keep my third finger down and I got it. It's going to be good as long as I keep it down. Well, guess what? It needs to be refreshed.
Your fingers are mostly down, then they're not in the way of another fingers who's trying to, especially the pinky, to do their job. If you're up and it's kind of pulling your pinky back, but if they're down, then your pinky has more freedom to move around. But it's not about gripping either. I don't know, it's good working with gravity.
Yeah, kind of like what you were saying, Steve. I mean, even if you do leave your fingers down, if that's how you're gonna play, you have to make sure that your hand isn't moving if you want it to still be in tune. And you can't really promise that, especially if you have pinky problems. There is not exactly a promise that your hand isn't gonna move a little bit, and then so when you go back, you think it's gonna be in tune, and it's not.
Which is why, even with all this talk about left hand technique, of course, the most important aspect of intonation is listening.
Yeah. Yeah, it's never been an intonation thing for me, like leaving the fingers down. It's more I guess efficiency of movement. Like if you're playing 1, 2, 3, 4, and if you lift, and actually I just saw my own fingers lift as I did that. It's like an extra motion.
We were curious, what are your thoughts on new finger versus old finger shifts?
Like a case by case. Sometimes I ask the students, like, are you shifting with the new finger or with the old finger?
Well, I tell my students dogmatically to shift with the new finger. And, I say these questions like, do you shift with the new finger or the old finger? And this is like the difference, I think, in pedagogy, like if you're teaching kids, I think you have them shift with the old finger so that they get a sense of positions, right? So my students who take pedagogy with Mimi Zweig and Brenda Brenner, they said, well, we didn't learn it that way. We learned shift with the old finger. But again, if you're going fast, you're not going to go, you're not going to shift to the new finger and then, because that means you have to then practice the shift to the old finger to make sure that's accurate. And then you got to practice the distance between the old finger and the new finger to make sure that's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
I think, right? I hope somebody that hears this doesn't think I'm some kook, quack, some heretic. But if you're going to use the old finger, don't you have to practice the shift in the old finger first?
Yeah, although sometimes there are certain fingers that know certain positions a little better, especially one, right? And so if you're trying to shift to something that's on 4, sometimes if you just kind of like think of where 1 is, then it's much easier to find the 4.
Well, why do you think 1 is easier than 4?
For me, it's always more stable. When you're learning positions at the beginning, like always where's the 1?
I think I talked about this with Sheila Brown during our master class at the Total Workshop, how it almost seems like we should start teaching scales where you start at the top and just use your 4th finger. That way you're basing it around your 4th finger and like having more balance. Whereas when you're always starting with your 1, this is in a very strong position and your weakest finger is in such a weak position.
Well, that sounds like a doctoral dissertation topic. You could write a scale book starting on 4. You can revolutionize pedagogy. Then you can go on the road and do workshops.
Maybe I should do this.
And you can have Rachelology or Annaology.
Rachanaology. And is there anything else you want to say to the viewers?
I say find your own way.
And Professor Wei?
Oh, I think what Steve said is super nice.
Perfect.
Thank you both so much again for agreeing to do this.
That's a nice way to start the year.
It was really fun.
It was great. See, we weren't contentious at all.
Not too much. I mean, you did have, just as we expected, opposing views on the left-hand lift or place.
I think they were complementary views.
On the surface, they were contentious.
We just wanted to spice it up.
Of course.